Disclaimer. This is 100% fiction. A made-up story for entertainment purposes only. What's good? Today's story is about Russ Coleman, 63, someone who'd already lived a whole life. Decades of experience, living solo in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado, where the only traffic is deer. Thought he'd seen everything. Turns out, nature had one more lesson. Fictional, but hits different. Drop a 1 if you believe Bigfoot is real. 2 if you think it's just legend. I'm curious. Here's how it started. Russ Coleman wasn't the type to believe in much beyond what he could see, touch, or track. At 63, he'd spent the better part of 4 decades as a search and rescue coordinator for Rocky Mountain National Park. He'd pulled lost hikers out of ravines, tracked down confused tourists who thought trail meant general direction, and just once, talked a black bear out of a campsite, using nothing but a firm voice and a cooking pot. The man knew these mountains, like most people know their morning commute. When he retired 2 years back, he didn't move to Florida or buy an RV. Nah, Russ went deeper. He found himself a cabin 15 miles past, where the paved road gives up. Nestled in a valley where the pine trees grow so thick the sunlight has to make an appointment to get through. The nearest neighbor was a good 8 miles east, and that neighbor was a family of elk who minded their own damn business. His cabin was small but solid, 1 bedroom, a wood-burning stove that he'd rebuilt himself, and a porch that wrapped around the front with a view of the valley that'd make a poet cry. Inside, everything had its place. His old rescue gear hung on pegs by the door rope, compass, first aid kit, flares. Not that he expected to use them anymore, but old habits die hard. The walls were lined with books, mostly field guides and survival manuals he'd read so many times the pages were soft as tissue paper. Most days followed the same rhythm. Wake up before dawn, make coffee strong enough to wake the dead, chop wood for an hour to keep the blood moving. Breakfast was whatever he had, usually eggs from the chickens he kept in a reinforced coop out back. Sometimes with wild mushrooms he'd foraged. Then he'd spend the day maintaining the property, reading, or just sitting on that porch, watching the world do its thing. People asked him before he left if he'd get lonely. Russ would just smile and say, "Lonely's when you're surrounded by people who don't get you. This is peace." But even peace got its surprises. It was late November, that weird time when autumn's packing its bags, but winter's already moved in without asking. The aspens had dropped their gold leaves weeks ago, leaving the mountainside looking skeletal and exposed. Snow had fallen 3 times already, nothing serious, just enough to dust the high peaks and remind everything living that the easy days were over. Russ was outside splitting logs when he first felt it, that prickle on the back of your neck that says someone's watching. He straightened up, axe still in hand, and scanned the tree line. Nothing, just shadows and the whisper of wind through bare branches. He shook it off, chalked it up to a deer, or maybe a curious fox. But the feeling came back the next day, and the day after that. By the 4th day, Russ started paying attention. See, when you've spent as many years in the wilderness as he had, you learn to trust your gut. Your gut doesn't lie. It doesn't overthink. When it says something's off, something's off. He started noticing other things too, small things that most folks would miss. A line of tracks near his property line, too big for a deer, too deep for a bear, just waking up from hibernation. He crouched down next to one, pressing his hand beside it for scale. The print was twice as wide as his palm, with 5 distinct toe impressions. The stride length, 6, maybe 7 feet between prints. "The hell," he muttered, pulling out his phone to snap a photo. Not that he had anyone to send it to, but documentation was documentation. Then there were the branches. High up on the pines surrounding his cabin, thick branches had been snapped, not fallen, snapped. Clean breaks, 12, 13 feet up. No storm had blown through. No wind strong enough to do that kind of damage. Whatever broke those branches had reach and strength. Russ wasn't scared. Exactly. More like curious. Cautiously curious. The kind of curious that keeps your hand near the bear spray on your belt. On the 7th day, he found the offering. It was sitting on his porch when he came back from checking his snare line. Right there on the top step, arrangement of smooth river stones stacked in a careful cairn, with sprigs of pine and dried berries woven between them. The thing was deliberate, intentional, and definitely hadn't been there when he left 2 hours earlier. Russ stood there for a solid minute, just staring. Then he slowly walked around the cabin, checking for tracks. He found them, those same massive prints, coming from the forest, approaching the porch, then retreating. But here's what got him. The spacing suggested careful, quiet steps. Not the heavy plodding of a bear or the bounding of a big cat. These were measured, thoughtful. "Okay," he said to the empty air. "You've got my attention." That night, Russ didn't sleep much. He sat in his chair by the window, rifle across his lap, not because he planned to use it, but because some instincts don't retire. He watched the tree line, watched the moonlight paint everything silver, watched for movement that never came. But he heard things, low sounds that could have been whined through rock formations, or could have been something else. Calls that weren't quite animal, weren't quite human. They echoed across the valley, lonely and searching. By 3 a.m., Russ made himself some coffee and accepted that whatever was happening, it was happening whether he understood it or not. And honestly, after 2 years of the same routine, part of him was almost grateful for the mystery. The universe does that, sometimes gets bored watching you settle, decides to shake the snow globe just to see what happens. Dawn came cold and clear, the kind of morning where your breath turns to ice crystals before it even leaves your mouth. Russ had just finished feeding the chickens who were pissed about the cold, and let him know it when he heard it. A sound, faint at first, carried on the wind. He froze, bucket of feed still in his hand, listening. There it was again, high-pitched, distressed. Not quite a cry, not quite a call. Something in between that hit his ears wrong, made his search and rescue instincts fire up like someone had flipped a switch. Russ dropped the bucket and moved toward the sound, his boots crunching through the frost-covered grass. The noise was coming from the northeast, past his property line, deep into the section of forest he didn't usually venture into. The terrain there got rough, fast, steep drops, hidden ravines, old mining caves that could swallow a man whole if he wasn't careful. The sound came again, clearer now, desperate, young. "Shit," Russ breathed, already moving faster. His legs protested 63 wasn't 43, no matter how much he hiked, but he pushed through it. Whatever was making that noise was in trouble, and if there was one thing Russ Coleman couldn't ignore, it was something in trouble. He grabbed his pack from the cabin, the one that still had everything. Rope, first aid, flares, water, emergency blanket. Muscle memory from 4 decades of rescue work. Then he was off, following the sound like a compass needle following north. The forest swallowed him quickly. Pine trees pressed close, their branches heavy with old snow. The ground was uneven, rocky, covered in patches of ice that wanted to send him ass over kettle with every step. But Russ knew how to move in terrain like this. Slow and steady, testing each foothold, using trees for balance. The cries got louder, more frequent, definitely young, definitely scared. He crested a small ridge and looked down into a narrow ravine. That's when he saw it. At first, his brain tried to make it make sense. Tried to say it was a bear cub, maybe, or a really big dog that had wandered too far from civilization. But even as those thoughts formed, they dissolved, because this wasn't either of those things. The creature was huddled against a rock face, partially hidden by fallen branches and snow. It was small, maybe 3 feet tall, covered in thick, dark brown fur that was matted with ice. Its proportions were all wrong for any animal Russ knew. Too human, arms too long, face too flat, eyes too big and round and intelligent. And those eyes, Jesus Christ, those eyes were looking right at him with an expression he'd seen 1,000 times on lost children, pure, terrified hope. The young Bigfoot let out another cry, weaker this time, and Russ watched as it tried to stand, only to fall back against the rock. One of its legs was bent at an angle that made Russ wince, broken or badly sprained at minimum. There was blood, not much, but enough on the fur of its shoulder, probably from a fall. Russ's mind was racing, trying to catch up with what his eyes were seeing. Bigfoot, an actual, no shit Bigfoot. Young one, injured, alone, and dying of exposure if he didn't do something. All those stories he'd heard over the years, told around campfires and in ranger stations. The tracks people claimed to find, the blurry photos, the distant howls, he'd always filed them under entertaining fiction, same category as UFOs and lake monsters. Turns out, the universe had jokes. The young Bigfoot made eye contact with him again, and Russ felt something shift in his chest. Fear, sure. Confusion, absolutely. But underneath all that, the same instinct that had driven him for 40 years. Something's hurt. Something needs help. So you help. Simple as that. Okay, Russ said quietly, keeping his voice low and calm the way he would with a spooked animal. Okay, little buddy, I see you. I got you. He started down the ravine slope, moving carefully. The young Bigfoot tensed, backing against the rock as much as its injured leg would allow. Russ stopped, held up his hands. I'm not going to hurt you, he said, even though he had no idea if it could understand words. But tone was universal. I'm going to help, yeah? That leg looks bad. You're freezing. We got to get you warm. He took another step. The creature whimpered, but didn't try to move. Russ slowly shrugged off his pack and pulled out the emergency blanket. This is going to look weird, but trust me, it works. Keeps the heat in. He moved closer, inch by inch, telegraphing every movement. When he was within arm's reach, he paused, giving the young Bigfoot time to process. Then, slowly, carefully, he wrapped the metallic blanket around its shoulders. The creature flinched at first, then seemed to register the warmth. Its big dark eyes blinked up at Russ, and something in that gaze hit him like a punch to the sternum. Intelligence, awareness, understanding. This wasn't an animal. This was someone. Yeah, Russ breathed. You get it, don't you? You know I'm trying to help. He examined the leg as gently as he could. Definitely broken below the knee. A clean break from the look of it. Probably from a fall. Maybe the kid was climbing and slipped. Or maybe it got spooked and ran without watching where it was going. Didn't matter now. What mattered was stabilizing it. Russ pulled out his first aid kit and splint materials. This is gonna hurt, buddy. I'm sorry, but I gotta set this if you're gonna heal right. He worked quickly and efficiently, the way he'd done hundreds of times before. The young Bigfoot cried out a sound that echoed through the ravine and made Russ's heart clench, but it didn't thrash or fight him. It seemed to understand, somehow, that the pain was necessary. Once the leg was splinted and wrapped, Russ sat back on his heels. Okay, now we got a problem. You're too heavy for me to carry all the way back to my cabin, and it's too cold to leave you here while I get help. Plus, who the hell would I call? Hey, 911. I found a baby Bigfoot? Yeah, that'd go great. The young Bigfoot tilted its head, watching him with those impossibly expressive eyes. Russ laughed, actually laughed, because what else could you do when your entire understanding of reality had just been rewritten? Your folks out there looking for you. That who's been watching my cabin. As if in answer, a sound echoed through the forest. Low, resonant, carrying across the valley like a foghorn. It wasn't like the young one's cries. This was deeper, fuller, heavy with emotion that Russ didn't need to be a cryptid expert to recognize. Someone was looking for their kid. Well, shit, Russ muttered. He looked at the young Bigfoot, then back toward the direction of that call. Guess we better let them know where you are. He pulled out his emergency whistle and blew 3 sharp blasts, the universal signal for location found. Then he cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted, Hey, down here. Your kid's okay. He's hurt, but he's okay. His voice echoed and died. The forest went quiet. Then came the sound of movement, not from one direction, but several. The crack of branches, the rustle of underbrush, the heavy thud of large bodies, moving fast through terrain that would slow a human to a crawl. Russ stood, positioning himself between the young Bigfoot and the approaching sounds. Not to defend against them, he had no illusions about his ability to fight off adult Bigfoots, but to show he wasn't a threat, hands visible, posture open, standing his ground without aggression. The first one appeared at the top of the ravine, and Russ's breath caught. She was massive, had to be 8 feet tall, maybe more, with broad shoulders covered in thick black fur. Her face carried the same features as the young one, but matured, angular, powerful, and her eyes, those eyes locked onto the small form behind Russ with an intensity that made his survival instincts scream. But she didn't charge, didn't roar. She just stood there, chest heaving, staring at her child. 2 more appeared beside her, then another, then 3 more. Within seconds, the ravine was surrounded by Bigfoots of various sizes, all focused on the young one wrapped in Russ's emergency blanket. The mother, because that's definitely what she was, took a step down the slope. Russ stayed still, barely breathing. He fell, Russ said quietly, knowing it was probably useless but needing to say it anyway. Broke his leg. I splinted it. He'll heal, but he needs rest and warmth. The mother's gaze shifted to him, really seeing him for the first time. Russ met her eyes and held them, the way he would with any parent he'd helped over the years. No fear, no aggression, just one being acknowledging another. She studied him for what felt like an hour, but was probably only seconds. Then she made a sound low, rumbling, like distant thunder. The other Bigfoots shifted, but didn't advance. Slowly, deliberately, the mother descended into the ravine. Each step was careful, calculated. When she reached the bottom, she moved past Russ close enough that he could feel the heat radiating from her body, smell the earth and pine scent of her fur, and crouched beside her child. The young Bigfoot made a sound relief, happiness, pain all mixed together, and reached for her with both arms. She gathered him up with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with her size, cradling him against her chest while examining the splintered leg. Then she looked at Russ again, and here's the thing that got him, the thing that he'd remember for the rest of his life. She nodded, a clear, unmistakable nod of acknowledgement, of thanks. Russ nodded back, throat tight. If you're feeling emotional, hit that like button. Is it just me? The mother stood, her child secure in her arms, and began climbing back up the ravine. The other Bigfoots created a protective circle around her, all of them moving as one unit. Before disappearing into the trees, the mother turned back one last time, her eyes finding Russ's in the fading afternoon light. Then they were gone, melting into the forest like they'd never been there. Only the trampled snow and broken branches proved Russ hadn't imagined the whole thing. He stood there in the ravine for a long moment, processing. His hands were shaking, adrenaline finally catching up with him. His mind was spinning through everything he thought he knew about the world, reality, what was possible and what wasn't. Well, he finally said to the empty air, that happened. The hike back to his cabin felt surreal. Every shadow looked different now. Every sound held new possibility. The forest he'd thought he knew inside and out suddenly felt alive in a way he'd never considered. When he finally got home, the sun was setting, painting the valley in shades of orange and purple that seemed almost too beautiful for the day he'd had. Russ dropped his pack by the door, started a fire, and poured himself 2 fingers of whiskey he kept for special occasions. This definitely qualified. He sat by the window, watching the darkness creep across the valley, wondering if they were still out there, wondering if the young one would be okay, wondering if he'd ever see them again. The answer came sooner than he expected. 3 days passed. Russ went about his routine, but everything felt different now. He caught himself scanning the tree line more often, listening for sounds that didn't quite fit. His rational mind kept trying to explain away what he'd seen. Stress-induced hallucination, strange lighting, bears with a genetic mutation, but his gut knew better. On the 3rd night, he woke to silence so complete it was almost loud. The kind of silence that means every living thing within a mile radius is holding its breath. Russ sat up slowly, reaching for his flashlight. Then he heard it, a low rumbling call from just outside his cabin. Not threatening, more like announcing. He pulled on his boots and jacket, grabbed his flashlight, and stepped onto the porch. They were there. All of them. The clearing around his cabin was filled with Bigfoots, dozens of them, standing in the moonlight like statues. The mother was at the front, the young one beside her, limping but standing on his splinted leg. Behind them, others of all sizes, from massive adults to smaller juveniles, all watching him with those same intelligent eyes. Russ's hand tightened on the porch railing. "Well," he said quietly, "guess this is a formal visit, huh?" The mother took a step forward, and Russ saw she was carrying something. She moved with a slow, deliberate pace until she was at the base of the porch steps. Then she set the object down gently before stepping back. Russ approached cautiously, crouching to examine it. The thing was carved from what looked like deer antler, shaped into something between a spiral and a knot, smooth as glass from handling. It was beautiful in its simplicity, clearly made with care and intention. A gift. She'd brought him a gift. Russ looked up at her, and the emotion that hit him was unexpected and overwhelming. Here was a mother thanking him for saving her child. Species didn't matter. Language didn't matter. The message was crystal clear. Russ's voice cracked. He cleared his throat. "You're welcome. I'd do it again in a heartbeat." The young Bigfoot hobbled forward, his mother's hand on his shoulder for support. When he reached the porch, he extended one long arm and dropped something else at Russ's feet. A pine cone, perfect and whole, dusted with frost. Kids and their gifts. Didn't matter if they were human or something else entirely. Russ picked up the pine cone carefully, holding it like the treasure it was. "Thank you, buddy. Glad you're doing better." The young one made a sound, a chirp almost, and his mother guided him back into the group. Then, one by one, the Bigfoots turned and walked back into the forest. No drama, no ceremony, just a quiet departure that felt more meaningful than any words could have been. Russ stood on his porch, carved antler in one hand and pine cone in the other, watching them disappear into the darkness. When the last one was gone, and the forest began to wake back up the owls, resuming their calls, the small creatures rustling in the underbrush, he finally went back inside. He set both gifts on his mantle, right above the fireplace where he'd see them every day. Proof that it happened. Proof that there was more to this world than what fit in field guides and biology textbooks. But the story didn't end there. Because 3 days later, something else happened that would test everything Russ thought he understood about his new neighbors. It started with smoke. But what Russ didn't know was, the universe wasn't done testing him, not by a long shot. Russ smelled it before he saw it. That acrid, chemical stink that doesn't belong in a forest. The kind that makes your nose burn and your instincts scream wrong, wrong, wrong. He was outside splitting wood, same as every morning, when the wind shifted and brought the smell with it. He straightened up, axe forgotten, and turned toward the northeast. There, above the tree line, a thin column of dark smoke rose into the pale morning sky. Not the white-gray smoke of a campfire, not the clean smell of burning pine. This was black, oily, and it was coming from deep in the valley where he'd found the young Bigfoot 3 days ago. "Shit," Russ muttered, already moving. He grabbed his pack, always packed, always ready, and headed into the cabin for his binoculars. From his porch, he trained them on the smoke source. What he saw made his blood run cold. Vehicles. 3 of them, big modified trucks with heavy-duty suspension and light rigs mounted on top. They were parked in a clearing about 2 miles northeast, near where the old mining roads cut through the forest, and there were people at least 6 that he could see moving around with purpose. Not hikers, not rangers. These folks had equipment. Serious equipment. Russ zoomed in on one of the trucks, stenciled on the side in fading letters. Cryptid Research Initiative, Field Division. "Oh, you've got to be kidding me," he breathed. He watched for another minute, his gut sinking. These weren't casual enthusiasts with trail cameras and hope. These were organized, professional, The kind of people who wouldn't just want photos, they'd want specimens. Proof. Evidence. They'd want to capture one. And Russ knew exactly where a whole tribe of them was living. His mind raced. He could call. Who? The local sheriff was 40 miles away and would laugh him off the phone. The Park Service? This was technically outside protected land. And even if it wasn't, what was he going to tell them? Hey, there are cryptid hunters trying to catch the Bigfoots I've been hanging out with. That'd go over great. No, he was on his own on this one. Russ grabbed his gear, everything he'd need for an overnight trip, if it came to that, and headed out. The smoke was his landmark, but he took a wide route, circling around, to approach from the west where the terrain was rougher, and he'd have cover. The hike took him 90 minutes, moving fast but careful. As he got closer, he slowed down, using every bit of tracking and stealth he'd learned over 4 decades in these mountains. The voices reached him first, carried on the wind. Tracks are fresh, less than 24 hours old. The whole family must be using this valley as a corridor. Did the trail cams pick up anything? 3 separate individuals, 1 juvenile. Footage is going to make us famous, Martinez. We're talking book deals, documentary series. Let's catch one first, before we plan the media tour. Set up the nets on the south approach. If they follow their usual pattern, they'll come through here at dusk. Russ went still, hidden behind a cluster of boulders about 50 yards from their camp. He counted 6 people, total 4 men, 2 women, all dressed in tactical outdoor gear that probably cost more than his truck. They had laptops, cameras, some kind of sensor equipment spread across fold-out tables, and nets, industrial-strength nets that would tangle and hold anything that ran into them. And the worst part, they were setting up right in the path the Bigfoot tribe would use to reach the higher elevations where Russ had seen them before. These people had been watching, studying patterns. They knew the tribe's roots. Russ backed away carefully, making sure he was well out of earshot before he started moving faster. His mind was working through options, and none of them were great. Option 1, confront them directly, try to convince them to leave. Likelihood of success, 0. These people had invested time and money. They weren't going anywhere, just because a random old guy asked nicely. Option 2, call in some kind of false emergency to get authorities out here, create enough chaos to scatter the operation. Problem, it'd only buy a day or 2 at most, and these people looked committed. Option 3, warn the Bigfoots. Get them to change their route. Stay hidden until the hunters gave up and moved on. Option 3 was looking like the only real choice, which meant Russ needed to find the tribe, and fast. He headed deeper into the valley, toward the areas where he'd seen the heaviest concentration of tracks before. The sun was climbing toward noon, and he had maybe 6 hours before dusk when the hunters expected their targets. The forest was quiet as Russ moved through it. Too quiet. The usual bird calls were muted, the small mammals staying hidden. Even the trees seemed to be holding their breath, like they knew something was coming. Russ stopped at a stream to refill his water bottle and reassess. He was 2 hours from the hunting camp now, in thick old-growth forest where the pines were so tall they seemed to scrape the sky. This was the kind of place that felt ancient, untouched, the kind of place where legends lived. He cupped his hands around his mouth and made a sound, not quite a howl, not quite a call, something in between that he'd heard the Bigfoots make. It felt ridiculous even as he did it, but what else did he have? The echo died away. Silence. Russ waited, counting seconds. 30, 60, 90. Then, faint and distant, an answer. The same low, rumbling call he'd heard before. Coming from the northwest, maybe a mile away. Thank God, Russ breathed and started moving. The terrain got rougher as he climbed, the forest floor rising in steep pitches covered in loose rock and old needles that wanted to send him sliding with every step. His lungs burned 63, wasn't 43. His knees kept reminding him, but he pushed through it. Another call, closer now. This one had a questioning tone to it, if that was even possible. Like, "Who's there?" Russ called back, trying to make his tone urgent, friendly but urgent. "Please understand," he muttered between breaths. "Please let this work." He crested a ridge and stopped. They were there, about 20 of them, gathered in a natural clearing surrounded by massive boulders that formed a kind of amphitheater. The mother he'd met before was there, the young one with the splinted leg staying close to her side. The others were arranged in what looked like a defensive formation, the larger adults on the outside, the younger ones protected in the center, and all of them were watching him. Russ raised his hands slowly, showing he was unarmed, unthreatening. "I need you to listen," he said, knowing they probably couldn't understand the words, but hoping like hell they'd get the tone. "There are people, bad people, down in the valley. They're hunting you." The mother stepped forward, her massive form moving with surprising grace. Her eyes locked onto his, and Russ felt that same intelligence, that same awareness he'd seen before. "They have nets," Russ continued, pulling out his phone and swiping to a photo he'd managed to take from his hiding spot. He held it up, knowing it was a long shot. "These people, they want to catch you, take you away. You can't use your usual route tonight. You have to go around. Stay hidden." The mother moved closer, looking at the phone screen. Her expression, and yes, she had expression shifted from curiosity to what Russ could only describe as understanding. She'd seen humans before, probably from a distance. She knew they could be dangerous. She made a sound, low and complex, and several of the other adults responded. Russ watched the exchange, fascinated despite the urgency of the situation. They were communicating, discussing, debating, maybe. Then the young Bigfoot limped forward, breaking from his mother's side. He approached Russ directly, his dark eyes huge and trusting, and touched Russ's hand with his own large fingers, surprisingly warm, incredibly gentle. The kid remembered being helped. "Yeah, buddy," Russ said softly. "Same deal. I'm trying to help again." The young one turned to his mother and made a series of sounds, chirps and rumbles mixed together. The mother watched her child, then looked at Russ with an expression he couldn't quite read. Then she did something that made Russ's throat tight. She placed one massive hand on her child's head, then gestured to Russ and to the valley below. A question, clear as day. "Show me. You want me to show you where they are?" Russ asked. Yeah, I can do that. But we got to be quiet, careful. Comment what you'd do in this situation. Run or stay. Be honest. No judgment." The mother made a gesture to the others, some kind of signal, and 4 large males stepped forward. The rest of the tribe began moving in the opposite direction, heading higher up the mountain toward safety. These 4 would come with Russ. They'd scout the threat. Smart. Russ had to admit, they were damn smart. The journey back was surreal. Russ led the way, moving as quietly as he could, while 4 8-foot-tall Bigfoots followed him through the forest with footsteps so silent he had to keep looking back to make sure they were still there. They moved through the terrain like ghosts, using the landscape in ways that would have made a Navy SEAL jealous. When they got within a 1/4 mile of the hunter's camp, Russ signaled for them to stop. The mother had stayed with the main group, but the largest male, the one Russ was pretty sure was the tribe's leader, the same one who'd stood at the edge of the ravine 3 days ago, moved up beside him. Together, they crept forward until they could see the camp through the trees. The hunters had made progress. The nets were fully deployed now, stretched across the main game trail, with triggering mechanisms that would spring them shut the moment something large passed through. They'd also set up what looked like bait, some kind of food source, maybe, or scent markers. The male beside Russ went completely still. Russ could feel the tension radiating off him, could sense the barely controlled anger. This was his family these people were hunting, his home they were invading. Russ touched the Bigfoot's arm lightly, a gesture that probably bordered on suicidal but felt necessary. When those dark eyes turned to him, Russ pointed to the nets, then made a cutting motion. Then he pointed to himself and to the camp, miming distraction. Finally, he pointed to the Bigfoot and back toward the tribe, making a sweeping motion that he hoped conveyed, "Take your family and go. Different route. Stay safe." The leader watched him, processing. Then, slowly, he nodded. But he didn't leave immediately. Instead, he made a gesture of his own, pointing at Russ, then at himself, then intertwining his fingers together, a symbol Russ recognized from 100 different cultures. Together. Partnership. Alliance. "Yeah," Russ whispered. "Together." The leader touched his own chest, then Russ's, then turned and melted back into the forest with the 3 other males. Within seconds, they were gone, like they'd never been there. Russ stayed hidden, watching the camp as afternoon slid toward evening. He needed a plan. These people were professional, prepared, and dedicated. They wouldn't scare easy, and they sure as hell wouldn't leave just because someone asked. But Russ had something they didn't. 40 years of mountain experience, intimate knowledge of this valley, and the absolute certainty that he was on the right side of this fight. As the sun started to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees, Russ made his decision. If he couldn't make them leave, he'd make damn sure they couldn't catch anything. He waited until the camp settled into early evening mode, 3 people by the fire, 2 at the monitoring station, 1 doing perimeter checks. Then he moved. The first net was easy. Russ had cut through tangled metal cables and rope 1,000 times during rescue operations. His knife was sharp, and he knew exactly where to cut to make the whole mechanism useless without it being immediately obvious. The second net was trickier. He had to work while one of the hunters was walking perimeter only 50 yards away, moving in the deepening shadows like a ghost himself. Every sound felt amplified, the whisper of his knife through synthetic fiber, his own breathing, the crack of a branch somewhere to his left that made him freeze for a solid 30 seconds. But he got it done. The third net, he almost got caught on. He was halfway through the main support rope when voices approached 2 of the hunters, talking in low voices. Movement on trail cam 3. Could be them, could be deer. We've had 6 false alarms today. This looked bigger. I'm telling you, Martinez, they're close. Russ pressed himself flat against a fallen log, his heart hammering against his ribs. The hunters passed within 10 feet of him, so close he could smell their coffee and cigarettes. If they looked down, if they happened to shine a light in his direction, it was over. But they kept walking, their attention on the trail ahead, on the approaching dusk that would bring their prey. Russ finished the cut and moved on. The fourth and final net was positioned at a natural bottleneck between 2 large rock formations, the perfect ambush point, and also the hardest to access without being seen. The monitoring station had a direct line of sight to it. Russ circled wide, coming at it from above, scrambling over rocks that wanted to send him tumbling down into the hunter's camp with every step. His hands were scratched, his jacket torn, and his knees were screaming at him, but he made it. This net was different, heavier gauge, reinforced, meant for something big and strong. The thought of what would happen if one of the Bigfoots got caught in it made Russ's stomach turn. They'd be tangled, trapped, terrified. These people would document them, study them, take them away, turn them into science projects or worse, tourist attractions. Not on his watch. This one took longer to cut. The blade wanted to slip on the synthetic fibers, and he had to saw at it, the sound making him wince with every stroke. Sweat dripped into his eyes despite the cold. His hands were shaking adrenaline, exhaustion, or both. Finally, the main cable gave way with a soft snap that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet forest. Russ quickly disguised the damage, leaving the net looking intact from a distance, but completely useless if anything actually triggered it. He was climbing back up and over the rocks when he heard it a shout from the camp below. Hey, hey, someone's been at the nets. Shit. Russ moved faster, his stealth abandoned for speed. Behind him, the camp erupted into chaos, flashlights sweeping the forest, voices shouting, the sound of people grabbing equipment and fanning out. Someone sabotaged them. All 4 sites. Find them. They can't have gone far. Russ ran, not along the trails where they'd expect, but straight up the mountain, using terrain too rough for anyone not desperate or crazy to attempt. Rocks tore at his hands as he climbed, his lungs burning, his legs feeling like rubber. A light swept across the rocks below him, voices getting closer. Then, from the darkness above, a hand, massive, covered in dark fur, reaching down toward him. Russ didn't hesitate. He grabbed it, and the Bigfoot leader hauled him up onto a ledge with the kind of strength that made Russ's rescue skills look like amateur hour. Another male was there too, helping pull Russ into a narrow crevice between two boulders, a hiding spot he'd never have found on his own. They pressed back into the darkness just as light swept across the rock face where Russ had been seconds before. "I don't see anything. Keep looking. Whoever it is, they're protecting these things. Maybe it's a local, someone who doesn't want us here." Then they just made this personal. Nobody sabotages a professional operation and walks away. The lights lingered, searching, probing the darkness. Russ held his breath, feeling the warmth of the two Bigfoots pressed against him in the small space. They were absolutely still, barely breathing, their discipline impressive. Finally, after what felt like an hour, but was probably only 5 minutes, the hunters moved on, heading back toward their camp to assess the damage and probably plan their next move. Russ let out a shaky breath. "Thanks," he whispered to the darkness. A low rumble answered him, the Bigfoot equivalent of "you're welcome," maybe, or "that was close," or possibly "you're crazy, old man." All fair assessments. They stayed hidden until full dark, until the hunters had retreated to their camp and the forest had settled back into its natural rhythms. Then the leader moved first, gesturing for Russ to follow. They traveled through the night, taking a route Russ never would have found on his own game trails and natural passages that wound through the mountain like a secret highway. The other male ranged ahead, scouting, while the leader stayed with Russ, occasionally steadying him when the terrain got tricky, or guiding him around obstacles he couldn't see in the darkness. It was trust on a level Russ had never experienced. These beings, creatures that should be terrified of humans, that had every reason to want nothing to do with his species, were protecting him, helping him, treating him like one of their own. They reached the tribe's new location around midnight. The group had moved to a sheltered valley on the far side of the mountain, a place with natural overhangs and defensive positions. When Russ stumbled into the clearing, exhausted and battered, the young Bigfoot limped forward immediately, making happy chirping sounds. The mother approached more slowly, her eyes moving over Russ, taking in his torn clothes, his scratched hands, his obvious exhaustion. Then she did something Russ wasn't expecting. She reached out and gently touched his face, her massive hand surprisingly gentle, checking for injuries the way any mother would. "I'm okay," Russ managed, his voice rough. "Just tired. Your family's safe. The hunters can't catch anyone now. Not with those nets cut." She seemed to understand, if not the words, then the meaning. She made a sound, soft, approving, and gestured toward the center of the group. What happened next would stay with Russ for the rest of his life. The tribe formed a circle, and they brought Russ into the center of it, not as a prisoner or a curiosity, but as one of them. They sat, and Russ sat with them. They shared food roots and berries he didn't recognize, but ate anyway because refusing felt wrong. The young ones approached him cautiously, touching his strange hairless skin, examining his pack with gentle curiosity. The leader sat beside him, and in the firelight, because yes, they had fire, carefully controlled and banked, Russ saw intelligence in those eyes that rivaled any human's, maybe exceeded it. They didn't speak, not in any language Russ could understand, but communication happened anyway. Through gestures, through expressions, through a shared understanding that transcended words. They were asking, will the hunters leave? Russ shook his head slowly. Probably not. Not yet. They've invested too much. They'll regroup, bring more equipment, try again. The leader's expression darkened. He looked at the tribe, his responsibility, his family, and Russ could see the weight of it. How do you protect your people from something that won't stop, that keeps coming with better technology and greater determination? But, Russ said, leaning forward, "I have an idea. It's risky, and it might not work." But he pulled out his phone, pulling up maps, trying to show them through pictures what he was thinking. The hunters expected the Bigfoots to run, to hide, to behave like animals that could be tracked and cornered. But what if they didn't do that? What if they did something the hunters would never expect? Russ looked at the leader. "What if we made them think you're not real after all?" The Bigfoot tilted his head, curious, and Russ started explaining his plan, using every ounce of creativity and tactical thinking he'd developed over 4 decades of outsmarting mountains, weather, and bad situations. It was crazy. It was risky. It required perfect timing and cooperation between species that shouldn't even be able to communicate. But looking around at the tribe, at the mother, with her healing child, at the young ones playing despite the danger, at the elders, watching with patient wisdom, Russ knew they had to try. Because if they didn't, these people would just be the first. Once one group succeeded in capturing proof, others would follow. The tribe would have no peace, no safety, ever again. So, Russ said quietly, looking at the circle of faces watching him in the firelight, "Who's ready to pull off the greatest magic trick these mountains have ever seen?" Little did the hunters know, they weren't dealing with simple forest creatures anymore. They were up against something far more clever. The plan came together over the next 2 days, and honestly, it was the kind of scheme that would have gotten Russ laughed out of any ranger station. But sitting there with the tribe, watching them understand and adapt and contribute their own ideas through gestures and demonstrations, he realized something profound. Intelligence wasn't about language or technology. It was about problem solving, creativity, and the will to protect what mattered. Here's what they came up with. Phase 1, misdirection. The hunters had trail cameras set up all over the valley, motion, activated equipment designed to capture proof. So Russ and the tribe would give them proof, just not the kind they wanted. Using branches, old fur shed naturally during seasonal changes, and carefully arranged rocks, they'd create evidence that was just slightly too perfect, too convenient. The kind of thing that would make seasoned researchers start doubting themselves. Phase 2, the reveal. Once the hunters were fully invested in this new evidence, believing they were close to a breakthrough, the tribe would execute the biggest part of the con. But Russ is getting ahead of himself. Let him walk you through how it actually went down. Day 1 started before dawn. Russ and 3 of the younger males, fast, agile, and apparently finding this whole thing hilarious, based on their huffing sounds that he was pretty sure were Bigfoot laughter, moved through the forest to the hunter's camp. The first trail camera was easy. Russ disabled it temporarily while one of the young Bigfoots stood in frame, deliberately out of focus, just long enough for a few shots. Then they arranged branches and stones in a pattern that looked ritualistic, but was actually just random, the kind of thing that would send cryptoanthropologists into a frenzy of meaningless analysis. At the second location, they did something even better. Using mud and charcoal, they created footprints, but they made them slightly wrong. Toes in weird positions, depth inconsistent, stride length that would suggest something physically impossible. Experts would look at these and immediately call fake, which was exactly the point. By the time the sun was fully up, they'd hit 6 different camera locations, leaving a trail of evidence that was simultaneously compelling and suspicious. Bigfoot existed, but also maybe someone was hoaxing the whole thing. Russ watched from a distance as the hunters checked their cameras that afternoon. Even from a quarter-mile away, he could see the body language, excitement, then confusion, then heated discussion. One guy kept pointing at his laptop screen, shaking his head. Another was gesturing wildly, clearly arguing. Perfect. That night, Phase 2 began. The hunters had set up new nets, lighter, more mobile, designed to be repositioned quickly. They'd also brought in thermal imaging equipment, the expensive kind that could supposedly differentiate between known animals and unknown heat signatures. What they didn't know was that the tribe had been watching humans for generations. They understood technology better than Russ had initially realized. Not how it worked, maybe, but what it did and how to work around it. The thermal cameras relied on heat signatures, right? So what happens when you can't get a clear reading? The answer: controlled brush fires, carefully managed and positioned to create heat blooms that would overwhelm the sensors. The smoke would obscure visual cameras, and in the chaos, the tribe would move through, leaving more evidence that contradicted itself. Russ's job was the most dangerous part. He had to get close enough to the main camp to plant something special, a device that would change everything. He moved through the darkness like a ghost, every skill he'd learned over 40 years in these mountains coming into play. The hunters had set up a perimeter alarm system, but Russ had walked every inch of this valley. He knew the spots where the sensors were blind, where the coverage had gaps. The camp was quiet but not asleep. 2 people were on watch, monitoring their equipment arrays. Russ could see the glow of laptop screens through the tent windows, hear the low murmur of conversation. He circled to the equipment tent, the one filled with their recording devices, backup drives, and most importantly, their main computer system, where all the evidence was being compiled. This was the part that made Russ's hands shake. He wasn't just sabotaging nets now. He was about to commit what amounted to a cyber crime, albeit a low-tech one. The device he pulled from his pocket was laughably simple, a small USB drive that his nephew, a tech-savvy kid in Denver, had prepared for him last year as a joke. For when you finally get internet out there, Uncle Russ, the kid had said. It was loaded with corrupted files that looked like real data, but were actually garbage, designed to create chaos in any system that tried to process them. Russ had called his nephew 2 days ago from a rare spot with cell service, explained that he needed something that would completely fuck up a computer without obviously being a virus. The kid had laughed and walked him through how to modify the drive. Now, crouched beside the equipment tent, Russ found the external hard drive where they were backing up all their footage. He unplugged it, inserted his device, transferred the corrupted files into their system, then plugged everything back in exactly as it had been. The beauty of it. They wouldn't know until they tried to compile everything for their big reveal. And by then, it would be too late. He was backing away from the tent when a voice cut through the darkness. "Hey, who's there?" A flashlight beam swept toward him. Russ dropped flat, pressing himself into the shadow of a supply crate. His heart hammered against his ribs. Too close. He'd gotten too close. "Probably just an animal," another voice called. "We're in the middle of the woods, Martinez. Things make noise. I swear I saw something." The beam passed inches over Russ's head. He held his breath, didn't move a muscle. In the distance, right on cue, one of the controlled fires flared up, drawing attention. Shit, the thermal cameras are going haywire. Is that smoke? There's something moving out there, multiple somethings. The hunters abandoned their perimeter check, rushing to their monitoring station. Russ used the chaos to slip away, moving fast and low, his body protesting every movement but his mind sharp with adrenaline. He made it back to the rally point, a sheltered overhang about a mile from the camp where the leader was waiting. The big Bigfoot took one look at Russ's expression and made a questioning sound. "Done," Russ panted. Phase 2 complete. Now we just need Phase 3. Phase 3 was the finale, and it required something Russ had never expected to coordinate: theater. The hunters were frustrated, confused, and starting to doubt themselves. Good. That's exactly where they needed to be. Now, to push them over the edge. The tribe spent the next day in careful preparation. They'd found an area with unique acoustic properties, a natural amphitheater of rock where sound bounced and echoed in strange ways. Here, they'd staged the final performance. As dusk approached on the 3rd day, Russ made his way to a position overlooking the hunters' camp. He had his emergency radio, the kind used for search and rescue operations, and he'd already tuned it to the frequency he'd overheard the hunters using. He keyed the mic. "This is Ridge Patrol to base camp. I've got movement on the north face. Multiple large figures. Requesting backup." He released the key and waited. Below, he saw the camp erupt into activity. The hunters grabbed their gear cameras, nets, tranquilizer rifles that made Russ's blood boil and headed north, exactly as planned. They were leading them straight into the amphitheater where the tribe was waiting. Russ moved parallel to the hunters, staying hidden, watching them stumble through the forest with their flashlights and their confidence and their complete lack of understanding about what they were walking into. When the hunters reached the amphitheater's edge, they stopped. Even from his position, Russ could see why. The sounds were incredible calls and howls and roars that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the rock walls in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint the source. There, did you see that? Where? I don't see anything. The thermal's picking up signatures, but they don't make sense. They're too big, too spread out. Wait, is that, oh my God, there's one. What the hunters were seeing or thought they were seeing were carefully choreographed movements. The tribe had split up, using the terrain and the failing light to appear as fleeting shadows. A massive figure would appear on the left, then vanish. Something smaller would dash across an open area on the right. The thermal cameras were going crazy, picking up heat signatures that didn't match any known animal. But here's the genius part. None of it was clear. None of it was definitive. Every sighting was just ambiguous enough to be questioned. Was that really a Bigfoot? Or was it a bear standing on its hind legs? Was that a juvenile? Or just a weirdly shaped log? The hunters were running around, filming everything, shouting to each other, and slowly, inevitably, starting to argue. That footage is too blurry to be useful, but the thermal signature could be anything. We need something concrete. We've been out here for a week, and we've got nothing but questionable evidence and corrupted files. That last part made Russ smile. They'd found the corrupted data. He watched as the frustration built, as the team started fragmenting. One woman threw up her hands and headed back toward camp. Two of the men were shouting at each other about methodology. This was exactly what happened when people were so sure of something that they stopped being objective. They imploded. But the tribe wasn't done yet. From the darkness of the amphitheater, a sound emerged. Not a roar or a howl, but something else entirely. It started low, almost like a hum, then built into a complex vocalization that had harmonics and tones that shouldn't have been possible from a single throat. Other voices joined in the whole tribe, creating a symphony that was beautiful and eerie and absolutely otherworldly. The hunters froze. Every single one of them stopped moving, stopped arguing, and just listened. For a moment, Russ thought the plan might backfire. The sound was too perfect, too organized. It would prove that these beings were intelligent, sophisticated, deserving of protection. Then one of the hunters laughed. A short, bitter bark of laughter. It's a recording. It has to be. Someone's playing us. What? Think about it. The ambiguous footage, the too perfect evidence, the corrupted files. And now this? Someone's running an elaborate hoax. Some local who doesn't want researchers here. Probably. But the footprints can be faked. We've all seen hoaxed prints before. The thermal signatures. Bears. Just bears. And we've been seeing what we wanted to see. Russ watched the belief drain out of them, replaced by embarrassment and anger. The cognitive dissonance was too much. Either Bigfoots were real, coordinated, and had made fools of them, or it was all fake, and they'd wasted time and money chasing shadows. Human ego being what it is, they chose the second option. Who's watching at midnight? Comment, so I know my night owls are here. The pack-up happened the next morning. Russ observed from a distance as the hunters loaded their equipment, their movements sharp with frustration. He heard fragments of conversation carried on the wind, complete waste of resources, probably just some hermit with too much time. Never should have trusted those trail cam images. By noon, the trucks were rolling back down the mountain, leaving nothing but tire tracks and a cleared campsite. They'd be back in their cities by evening, probably already writing off the whole expedition as a learning experience. Maybe they'd try again somewhere else, but they wouldn't come back here. Not to this valley, not where they'd been so thoroughly played. Russ waited until the sound of engines had faded completely before making his way back to the tribe's location. When he crested the final ridge and looked down into the sheltered valley, his throat went tight. They were all there, waiting. The whole tribe, from the ancient elders to the young ones, barely bigger than human children. When they saw him, a sound went up, that same complex vocalization from the night before, but warmer now, celebratory. The leader approached first, his massive form silhouetted against the afternoon sunday. He stopped in front of Russ, and for a moment, they just looked at each other. Then the leader did something Russ never expected. He bowed his head slightly, a gesture of respect that transcended species. Russ found himself bowing back, his eyes burning. "We did it," he said, his voice rough. "They're gone. They think it was all fake." The mother came forward next, her healed child beside her. The young one limped over, his leg was healing well. Russ was relieved to see and pressed something into Russ's hand. Another gift. This one, a small stone with a hole worn through the center, polished smooth by river water. "Thank you, buddy," Russ managed. "Thank you all." What happened next was maybe the most extraordinary part of the whole extraordinary week. The tribe formed a circle again, but this time it felt different. This wasn't just acceptance, this was family. They brought out food, not just for themselves, but specifically for Russ. They'd learned what he could eat, what wouldn't make a human sick, and they'd gathered it carefully. As the sun set and the stars came out, the tribe began to tell stories. At least, that's what Russ thought they were doing. Different individuals would stand and make sounds, use gestures, and the others would respond with attention and emotion. Some stories seemed funny. The young ones would make that huffing laugh sound. Some seemed serious, maybe even sad. When it was his turn, and somehow, it became his turn, Russ stood and did his best. He told them about his life, about the people he'd rescued over the years, about his wife who'd passed 5 years ago, and how he'd come to the mountains to heal. He didn't know if they understood the words, but they listened with that same intense attention, and when he sat down, the mother reached over and touched his shoulder gently. They understood, not the language, but the meaning underneath. Loss, purpose, finding a new family when the old one was gone. The young Bigfoot fell asleep leaning against Russ's side, his breathing deep and even, completely trusting. The mother watched them both, her expression soft in the firelight, and Russ felt something in his chest crack open, grief and joy mixed together until he couldn't tell them apart. He'd spent 2 years alone in these mountains, thinking he'd found peace, but he'd really just found quiet. This messy, complicated, impossible connection with beings that shouldn't exist. This was peace. This was what it meant to matter again. They let him stay that night, sleeping among them under the stars, with the tribe arranged in a protective circle. When he woke at dawn, stiff and cold but more rested than he'd been in years, they were preparing to move on. The leader approached and gestured up, toward the higher peaks where humans rarely ventured. They'd stay there through winter, safe and hidden. But the gesture also included an invitation, Russ realized. A standing one, the valley, the mountains, the forest, they'd share it. Russ could come visit. They'd watch out for him as he watched out for them. "I will," Russ promised. "I'll check in on you all. Make sure those hunters don't come back. And if they do," he didn't finish the sentence, but the leader seemed to understand. They were allies now, partners. The goodbyes were harder than Russ expected. The young ones clustered around him, touching his strange hairless hands with gentle curiosity. The elders nodded with what looked like approval. The mother gave him one more gift, a woven band made from plant fibers, sized perfectly for a human wrist, with small carved wooden beads worked into the pattern. "I'll treasure it," Russ said, his voice thick. "All of it." Then the tribe was moving, flowing up the mountain like water, their massive forms disappearing into the wilderness they were so perfectly adapted to. Within minutes, they were gone, leaving only the faintest of tracks and the memory of their presence. Russ stood there for a long time, watching the empty forest, feeling the weight of the woven band on his wrist. Then he turned and started the hike back to his cabin. The next few weeks fell into a new rhythm. Russ went about his daily routine, chopping wood, maintaining the property, reading by the fire, but it all felt different now. The forest wasn't empty anymore. He'd see signs of the tribe occasionally. a footprint near his property line, arrangements of stones that served as markers or messages, once a stack of firewood that he definitely hadn't cut himself appearing overnight. They were keeping an eye on him, just like he was keeping an eye on them. He checked the hunter's social media. He had to hike to the ridge to get cell service, but he made the trip and found exactly what he expected. Posts about the hoax of the century, think pieces about how easy it was to fake cryptid evidence, forums debating whether someone had punked them or if they'd punked themselves. The Cryptid Research Initiative had moved on to chasing Mothman sightings in West Virginia. Perfect. Subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss the next one. It's gonna be even crazier. Winter came hard that year. The snow piled up 6 feet deep in places, and the temperature dropped so low that just breathing hurt. But Russ's cabin stayed warm, his firewood supply mysteriously never running low despite how much he burned. And on the coldest nights, he'd sometimes hear them out there, distant calls echoing across the valley, checking in, letting him know they were okay. He'd step out onto his porch, into the brutal cold, and call back. Not words, just sounds. The language they'd taught him without meaning to. And they'd answer, and for a moment, the mountain felt less lonely and more like home than anywhere Russ had ever lived. Spring came eventually, the way it always does. The snow melted, the creeks ran high and wild, and the forest came back to life. Russ was on his porch one morning, coffee in hand, watching the world wake up, when he heard footsteps. The young Bigfoot emerged from the tree line, and Russ's heart soared. The kid was bigger now, his leg fully healed, moving with confidence and grace. Behind him came 2 other juveniles, around the same age, probably siblings or cousins. They approached the cabin cautiously, but without fear. "Hey, buddy," Russ said softly. "You brought friends." The young one chirped that same sound from months ago and held out his hand. In it was another stone, this one shot through with veins of quartz that caught the morning light. Russ took it carefully, adding it to the collection he'd started on his mantle. "Thank you. You want to stay for breakfast? I've got eggs, and I found some berries yesterday that I think you'd like." They stayed for an hour, the 3 young Bigfoots eating the food he offered and exploring his porch with gentle curiosity. When they left, heading back into the forest, Russ felt that same warm certainty he'd felt that night with the tribe. He wasn't alone. He'd never be alone again. Not here. Not in these mountains that held secrets and wonders that most of humanity would never believe. And you know what? That was okay. Some things weren't meant for the whole world. Some connections were meant to stay sacred, hidden, protected by the people, human and otherwise, who understood their value. Russ Coleman had come to the mountains to retire, to find peace, to live out his years in quiet solitude. Instead, he'd found purpose again. He'd found family. He'd found proof that the world was bigger, stranger, and more beautiful than he'd ever imagined. And he'd become something he never expected, the guardian of a secret that mattered more than any fame or recognition or proof ever could. Closing. Look, here's the truth that matters. Regardless of whether you believe in Bigfoot or not, sometimes the most important thing you can do is protect something vulnerable, even when no one else would understand, even when you get nothing in return except the knowledge that you did the right thing. Russ wasn't special. He was just a 3-year-old retired ranger who happened to be in the right place at the right time, who chose compassion over fear and cooperation over conquest. That's the real magic. Not that Bigfoot might exist, but that humans are capable of looking at something completely foreign, completely other, and choosing connection instead of exploitation. We live in a world that constantly tells us to be afraid of difference, to protect ourselves first, to trust only what we can prove and profit from. But what if we're missing the point? What if the most important things in life are the ones that can't be captured on camera or explained in a lab report? Family isn't always blood. Courage isn't always loud. And sometimes the most extraordinary encounters happen in the quiet places where humans rarely venture, between species that shouldn't be able to communicate but find a way anyway. So next time you're in the wilderness, whether it's a forest or a mountain or just a park at the edge of your city, pay attention. Look for the signs that someone else calls this place home. Listen for the sounds that don't quite fit. Be open to the possibility that you're not alone, and that maybe, just maybe, that's something to celebrate rather than fear. And if you ever get the chance to help something that needs it, even if it doesn't make sense, even if no one would believe you, even if you get nothing but a smooth stone and a memory in return, take it. Every single time, because that's what it means to be human at our best. Not conquering nature, but finding our place within it. Not proving something exists, but respecting its right to remain hidden. Not taking, but giving, and trusting that the universe remembers. This story was fiction, but the message is real as it gets. Compassion doesn't require understanding. Protection doesn't require proof. And sometimes the family we build is more important than the one we're born into. Russ Coleman learned that at 63. But you can learn it right now, whatever age you are, wherever you're watching from. Stay curious, stay kind, and keep your eyes open. You never know what's watching back. End of story. Disclaimer. This is 100% fiction, a made-up story for entertainment purposes only. No real Bigfoot were involved in the creation of this narrative, but maybe they should have been.